Welcome to another episode in the Cross Questioned. And we have been looking so far in this series at how the Bible, specifically the New Testament, speaks about the Easter story. And up to this point, we have got Jesus being arrested, he's been captured, and he's been taken before Herod and Pilate. And Herod and Pilate are sitting in between each other because neither of them wants to take responsibility for sentencing him, that neither of them can find any guilt in him. This is what we found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now we're getting to the point where John starts to fill in the blanks left behind by the other three gospel writers. Remember, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when they're writing their books, they are writing them long before John came along. John writes his book at a much later stage. John has been influenced by the teachings and the writings and the churches that were around that were set up by Paul. Paul is one of the converts who converted to Christianity, and he is now taken control of Christianity in the modern world. Then the book of John was written. So the book of John is Johnny come lately, really, because it's the last book to be added in. Even the writings of Paul predate John. So not all the books of Paul, some of them were written a bit later, or date a bit later. But John's gospel is the latest one. So what John does is he's got history on his side. So he can see the mistakes that Matthew made, Mark made, Luke made, and the comments that the people were making at the time when they read Matthew, Mark, and Luke's account. So John tries to correct any mistakes he makes. So he has used a lot of editorial rights in his writings. And so we'll find he writes himself into scenes. So he writes himself into the gospel in a way that will present himself in the best light possible. And how do we know this? Because he calls himself the disciple whom Jesus loved. And other verses as well, he calls himself the other disciple, who manages to get the other disciples into places which they would not be able to get into. So John fills in all the gaps left by the other three gospel writers. He makes Jesus now talk to Pilate when he is being interrogated. Remember that John's Jesus is very different to Matthew, Mark, and Luke's Jesus, or the Jesus that you and I may have become accustomed to through the media, or through theater, or through movies, or through anything else like that. So his Jesus is very powerful, very strong, not afraid of anything. This is the Jesus that has been portrayed in the Gospel of John. So he has Jesus being almost assertive and strong and powerful, somewhat insolent when he's talking to Pilate. And the narration goes something like this in the Bible. Pilate went back into his headquarters and summoned Jesus and says to Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" he asked. Some versions quote, "Are you the king of the Jews? I take it." Or some versions will say, "You are the king of the Jews, I take it." Whichever version you would like to take. But generally the question is, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus says to him, is it your idea, or has someone suggested that to you? The way that Jesus is portrayed here is very assertive and aggressive. Imagine if you or I, not that we are anything like a prophet, if we were brought before the judge for whatever charge it was, maybe you knocked somebody over with your car, and you were standing before the judge, and the judge would say, "What is your name?" You would be very afraid, we're very nervous when we speak. But not in John's gospel. John's gospel, he's got Jesus being very firm and very self-assured, not afraid of anything, like, I can take on anything. And so the narration continues like this in the Bible, where Pilate actually says to Jesus, when Jesus makes this statement, when Jesus says to him, "Is it your idea, or has somebody suggested to you?" Pilate says to him, "What? Am I a Jew?" In other words, how must I know? I'm not a Jew. Then the narration continues and says, "Your own nation and your chief priests have brought you before me. What have you done?" This is what Pilate continues to say to Jesus. So Jesus replies to him and says, "My kingdom does not belong to this world. If I did, my followers would fight to save me from being arrested by those Jews, or by the Jews, as most accounts have it. My kingdom authority comes from elsewhere." "You're a king then," says Pilate. And Jesus says, "King is your word." So you see Jesus as being very self-assured. Pilate says, so you're a king then? And Jesus says, well, it's your words. You say the word king. My task is to bear witness to the truth, says Jesus. For this I was born. For this I came into the world. And all of you are deaf and dumb who do not listen to my voice. I mean, this is very different to what we expect of the meek and mild and I don't say anything Jesus said we find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Then Pilate says to him, what is truth? Now they're having a philosophical discussion. So Pilate says, what is truth? And with these words went out again and went to speak to the Jews. Then Pilate says to the Jews, for my part, he said, I find no case against him. But you have a custom that I release a prisoner for you at Passover time. Would you like me to release the king of the Jews, or would you like me to release Barabbas, who was a bandit? And the crowd arose and said, not him, we want Barabbas released. Don't release Jesus, release Barabbas, the crook or the bandit. And this is found in John chapter 18, verse 33 onwards. So in this story, we see that a number of issues come up. Who is this Barabbas? John suddenly brings up this person's name. Who is this man Barabbas that has just been thrown into this whole scene? Why would people want him to be released while Pilate had asked for some information about Jesus? Both men had discussed between each other that they could find no problems with him. Here with John's story, we find that people are given an option. They're given an option. Either they can release Barabbas or they can release Jesus. Remember when Jesus was arrested, Jesus says, what am I? Am I a bandit that you come with your clubs and your swords and your armed guards? You could have arrested me at any other time. This is why it was mentioned at that time. This is why the dialogue was written, that Jesus was to say, what, am I a bandit? Because now the question is put to the people, would you like me to release Jesus, or would you like me to release the bandit? You see how the writer is trying to create a thought for the future. Now, it also says in this passage that we looked at, it was at the festive season, the governor asked to release one prisoner at the people's request. As it happened, the man known as Barabbas was then in custody for a rebellion who had committed murder in an uprising. So this is the version that we find in Mark chapter 15, verse 6 to 8. Now Matthew calls him a man of some notoriety. Barabbas, the man's name is. So Matthew calls him a man of some notoriety in Matthew 27, verse 16. Luke calls him the man had been put into prison for an uprising that had taken place in the city for murder. So Matthew calls him a very well-known criminal. Luke says he was put into prison for murdering, uprising against the Romans. Luke chapter 23, verse 19. And the story that sort of that continues from where we left off goes in, when the crowd came and asked for the usual favor, who would you like to have released, the king of the Jews? For they can find nothing wrong with him. They all chose to have Barabbas released. They said, release Barabbas and crucify the king of the Jews. They shouted, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. So Pilate asked them, why? And they shouted even louder, crucify him. And this is paraphrased from Mark chapter 15 from verse 14 onwards, which you can read yourself. Luke says that for the third time he spoke to them and asked, what has he done? And I can find no fault, I cannot find anything deserving and a capital offense, and therefore all I can do is simply flog him. But they insisted and they demanded, shouting that Jesus should be crucified. And Pilate asked the crowd, then what am I to do with this man? And they all shouted again, like the other version said, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. This can be found in Matthew chapter 27, verse 22 onwards. Now, according to John, the whole affair could not be so short and so simple, so he has his own version that he brings up. And this can be found in John chapter 19, verse 4 and 5. And it goes like this. Once more Pilate came out and said to the Jews, "Here he is. I am bringing him out to let you know that I can find no case or nothing wrong with him. I cannot find this man guilty." But before this happened, Pilate took him and had him flogged or beaten, had him whipped. And the soldiers, in the narration it says, the soldiers plaited a crown of thorns and placed on his head, and they put a robe on him. It was a purple cloak that they put around him. And then time after time they came out to him crying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and struck him in the face. This is what we find in John chapter 19, verse 1 to 3. Now it is strange that on one hand, Pilate concluded that Jesus was innocent, and yet he had him flogged anyway. If you find somebody not guilty, it's never the case if somebody is not guilty that you still pass a sentence against them and sentence them to some type of punishment. If somebody is not guilty, they're normally not guilty. Well, it's time for us to take a break, and when we get back from the break, we'll continue, inshallah.
The world is past.